Max Verstappen has spent years driving right on the edge of Formula One's rulebook. The aggressive overtakes, the radio messages, the constant pressure on stewards. That part isn't new. What is new is the feeling that Formula One's governing body has stopped treating Verstappen like a difficult champion and started treating him like a political problem. And if that sounds exaggerated, look at how quickly the atmosphere changed over the last 12 months. Suddenly, the FIA is talking more aggressively about driver conduct, public image, respect, language standards, steward authority. Meanwhile, Verstappen's reactions have become noticeably colder. Shorter answers in press conferences, visible frustration during penalty discussions, less interest in playing the diplomatic role Formula One usually expects from its biggest stars. That matters because Max Verstappen is not just another driver anymore. He's the center of the current Formula One era. 4 world championships, Red Bull dominance, one of the largest fan bases in motorsport. And inside the paddock, people know something else too. When Verstappen genuinely loses trust in a system, he rarely hides it for long. The public version of the story is simple. The FIA wants more professionalism. Verstappen thinks the sport is becoming overregulated. End of story, except the timing doesn't really support that explanation because this escalation didn't begin after one incident. It began after several controversial moments started stacking together across multiple race weekends. And once you line them up chronologically, the picture becomes a lot harder to ignore. At first, the relationship between Verstappen and the FIA actually looked manageable under Mohammed Ben Sulayem's leadership. The FIA president talked openly about restoring authority to the governing body after years of criticism following Abu Dhabi 2021. More consistency, stronger oversight, less chaos. But by mid 2024, drivers were already starting to quietly question whether consistency was actually improving. Austria became one of the first flashpoints. Verstappen's battle with Lando Norris triggered weeks of debate about racing standards. Some former drivers defended Max's aggression, others thought the FIA had allowed overly aggressive driving to become normalized. The important detail wasn't the contact itself, it was the reaction afterward. The stewarding explanations didn't fully satisfy either side. That detail matters more than people realize because Formula One depends heavily on drivers believing steward decisions follow a predictable logic. Once that trust weakens, every future incident becomes political. Then Singapore added another layer. Verstappen openly criticized aspects of FIA communication and conduct rules during media sessions. The response from officials felt noticeably sharper than previous years. Suddenly, conversations around driver behavior were becoming almost as prominent as conversations about racing itself. And inside the paddock, some team personnel started noticing something uncomfortable. The FIA seemed increasingly focused on optics. Not just racing standards, optics. The situation escalated further when disciplinary actions involving Verstappen started carrying symbolic weight beyond normal sporting penalties. Community service headlines, public reprimands, increased scrutiny over radio language and conduct. Even people who disagreed with Verstappen began questioning whether the FIA was unintentionally turning him into a political opponent instead of simply regulating him. Then came Jeddah, and this is where the timeline becomes difficult for Formula One to fully control. Because the Saudi Arabian Grand Prix reignited criticism over racing guidelines almost immediately. Verstappen argued certain rulings were becoming inconsistent. Analysts compared similar incidents involving multiple drivers across different weekends. Fans noticed the same thing. One overtake would be acceptable in one race, questionable in another, and penalized somewhere else entirely. Miami, Suzuka, Jeddah, Imola, different tracks, different incidents, different steward interpretations. The frustration wasn't only about penalties anymore, it was about predictability. And Verstappen's behavior started changing in subtle ways after that. His media answers became shorter, more sarcastic, sometimes deliberately vague. Red Bull also became more careful publicly. Christian Horner stopped escalating certain FIA criticisms directly, even when tensions were obvious. That silence was interesting because 2 years earlier, Red Bull would have attacked aggressively in public. Now they looked cautious, calculated, which raised a bigger question inside the paddock. What exactly did Red Bull think was changing behind the scenes? And why did Verstappen suddenly look like a driver preparing for a much larger confrontation than a simple steward disagreement? At this point, the easy explanation would be to say Verstappen simply hates stricter regulations. But that doesn't fully explain the pattern. Because if this were only about Max being emotional or aggressive, the tension would rise and fall depending on individual incidents. Instead, the opposite started happening. Every new controversy seemed to reinforce the same underlying problem. Nobody inside Formula One appeared fully confident about where the limits actually were anymore. And the drivers noticed. One example was the growing confusion around racing standards themselves. After Austria, multiple drivers admitted privately that they weren't fully sure how certain wheel to wheel situations would be judged from race to race. That uncertainty matters because Formula One drivers operate almost entirely on instinct at 300 kilometers per hour. If the interpretation changes every weekend, drivers stop trusting the framework around them. Verstappen became the loudest voice criticizing that instability, but he wasn't the only one feeling it. George Russell, through the GPDA, increasingly pushed for clearer communication between drivers and the FIA. Lewis Hamilton questioned consistency on multiple occasions. Fernando Alonso hinted several times that modern stewarding depended too heavily on interpretation rather than stable standards. Three world champions, different personalities, different teams, same frustration. That's when the story started looking less like Verstappen versus the FIA and more like a broader governance problem Formula One was struggling to contain. And then another contradiction appeared. The FIA kept publicly emphasizing professionalism and respect, but at the exact same time, some of the sport's biggest headlines were being created by controversial steward decisions themselves. Jeddah generated debate, Miami generated debate, Imola generated debate. Not because fans suddenly became more emotional, but because similar incidents kept producing different interpretations. Inside the paddock, people began paying attention to timing coincidences too. The FIA's push for stronger authority intensified during one of the most politically unstable periods Red Bull had faced in years. Christian Horner's internal controversy weakened the team publicly. Adrian Newey's future became uncertain. Rival teams sensed vulnerability. Suddenly, Red Bull no longer looked politically untouchable the way they did during the peak of their dominance, and Verstappen's role inside that environment became much more important because Max wasn't only Red Bull's lead driver anymore. He had effectively become the center of the sport's competitive legitimacy. As long as he kept winning comfortably, Formula One needed him visible, engaged, and commercially cooperative. But the relationship was becoming colder. What most broadcasts missed during this period was how often Verstappen stopped expanding on answers once FIA topics appeared in interviews. Watch the press conferences closely, short replies, controlled irritation, occasional sarcasm, then immediate disengagement. That behavioral shift tells you something. Drivers usually become more emotional when they think situations are temporary. They become quieter when they think the system itself is changing. And suddenly, several smaller incidents started looking different once viewed through that lens. The swearing discussions didn't look isolated anymore. The disciplinary symbolism didn't look isolated anymore. The steward inconsistencies didn't look isolated anymore. Together, they started resembling an institution trying to reassert authority over increasingly powerful personalities. That's where the political layer enters the story, because Formula One today is fundamentally different from Formula One 10 years ago. Netflix changed driver visibility, social media changed narrative control, team principals became public political actors, drivers built independent fan bases larger than some constructors, and Verstappen may represent the biggest challenge to centralized authority in the modern era of the sport. Not because he campaigns politically, because he doesn't need to. His influence comes from performance. When the fastest driver on the grid openly questions consistency, fans listen differently. Teams listen differently, media coverage shifts immediately. The FIA understands that, which creates a very uncomfortable dynamic behind the scenes. The governing body needs authority, but Formula One also needs Verstappen, and those two realities may now be colliding directly. There's also an irony here that people inside the paddock quietly acknowledge. For years, Formula One wanted stronger personalities, more rivalries, more emotion, more driver visibility. Drive to Survive accelerated that strategy massively. The sport became bigger globally because fans connected to drivers as individuals rather than just teams. But once drivers become global personalities, controlling the narrative becomes harder, especially when one of them keeps winning championships. That may be why this conflict feels different from previous FIA disputes. This doesn't feel like a temporary disagreement over one race weekend. It feels structural, almost like Formula One is trying to decide whether the future of the sport belongs more to the governing institution or to the stars capable of overpowering the institution publicly. And once you reinterpret the last 12 months through that framework, the entire story changes because suddenly this isn't really about Max Verstappen's attitude at all. It's about whether Formula One became too dependent on personalities powerful enough to challenge the system itself. Once that framework becomes visible, the next part of the story starts connecting very quickly. Because if the FIA really is trying to reinforce institutional authority, then the most important question becomes simple. The answer is consistency, and right now, consistency is exactly where Formula One looks weakest. Take the stewarding debates alone. Over the last 2 seasons, drivers, analysts, and even former race officials have repeatedly struggled to explain why nearly identical incidents sometimes produced completely different outcomes. One weekend, aggressive defending is hard racing. The next weekend, similar movement earns investigations or penalties. That unpredictability changes driver behavior immediately. Drivers stop focusing purely on racing, they start calculating interpretation. And Verstappen may be reacting to that more aggressively than anyone else because his entire driving style depends on operating at the absolute limit of available space. The Saudi Arabia discussions expose that perfectly. Several analysts pointed out that drivers themselves seemed uncertain about where the FIA's current threshold actually existed. Martin Brundle openly discussed the confusion around modern racing standards. Other former drivers questioned whether stewards were reacting consistently to pressure from media, narratives, and public backlash after controversial incidents. That's dangerous territory for Formula One. Because once fans begin believing steward decisions are reactive instead of principled, confidence in the system starts eroding race by race. And then there's the communication problem. The FIA wants drivers to behave more professionally in public, but Formula One's entire modern popularity surge was built on emotional transparency. Team radio explosions, driver frustration, heated rivalries, public disagreement. Netflix helped turn those moments into commercial assets. Now, Formula One suddenly appears uncomfortable with the exact emotional intensity that helped expand the sport globally. That contradiction matters, especially for someone like Verstappen, who has never shown much interest in becoming a carefully managed corporate personality. Inside the paddock, people understand something else too. Max Verstappen has options most drivers don't. He has long term financial security, championships, legacy, leverage, and maybe most importantly, he has repeatedly shown that he does not need Formula One. Emotionally, in the same way many drivers do, that changes negotiations completely. When Verstappen casually references retirement possibilities or dissatisfaction with the direction of the sport, teams and officials cannot automatically dismiss it as frustration. Because unlike younger drivers fighting for contracts, Verstappen's credibility gives those comments real political weight. That may explain why recent tensions feel unusually sensitive. The FIA cannot afford to look weak publicly. But Formula One also cannot afford prolonged hostility with its dominant champion during a major competitive transition period, because the timing becomes even more uncomfortable once you factor in 2026. New engine regulations, potential competitive reshuffling, Audi entering the sport, questions around Red Bull powertrains, uncertainty over whether Verstappen even wants to remain deeply invested in Formula One long term. All of that is happening simultaneously. And suddenly, the relationship between Verstappen and the FIA starts carrying consequences far beyond steward meetings or press conference frustrations. It starts affecting the stability of Formula One's next era. There's another layer here that loyal fans have quietly noticed over the last year. Verstappen's frustration no longer looks explosive, it looks calculated. That distinction matters enormously. Earlier in his career, Max reacted emotionally in real time, angry radio messages, heated confrontations, immediate responses, but recently many of his comments have sounded more controlled, almost detached, as if he's observing the political environment instead of merely reacting to it. That usually happens when elite athletes stop viewing problems as temporary, and Red Bull's behavior reinforces that interpretation. Christian Horner has become far more selective publicly during FIA controversies. Helmut Marko occasionally hints at frustrations, but the team rarely escalates conflicts fully anymore. That restraint suggests something important behind the scenes. Red Bull may believe the political balance inside Formula One is actively shifting. If that's true, the next phase becomes potentially explosive, because institutions typically tighten authority when they feel control weakening. But dominant athletes often push back hardest at the exact same moment. In Formula, the 1st of May now be entering that collision point, which brings the entire story back to the original controversy. The FIA likely believes stronger conduct enforcement would stabilize the sport's image. Instead, it may have accidentally amplified distrust among drivers, fans, and even teams already questioning steward consistency and governance transparency. And if Verstappen continues pulling emotionally away from the system while still dominating races, Formula One faces a uniquely modern problem. What happens when the biggest star in the sport stops fully believing in the structure surrounding him? Because at that point, every future controversy becomes bigger automatically. Every steward decision becomes political, every penalty becomes symbolic, every press conference becomes tense before it even starts. And the next few race weekends may reveal whether this relationship is repairable or whether Formula One is drifting toward a conflict neither side actually knows how to control.